Thank you so much, Wayne, for that introduction. It's wonderful to be here at such a great American institution as the Rotary Club, and speaking about a great American tradition, Presidential Inauguration Day, and doing so here at a great American venue, Queen Mary, of course. So let's begin. It's dawn on Inauguration Day in Washington, D.C. Huge amount of people gather on the Washington Mall. In 2009, it was all the way from the Capitol all the way to the Lincoln Memorial. We just lost our picture. They're there. Here we go. And they're there, of course, for the inauguration. People gather to watch in other places as well, in Times Square in New York City, in classrooms around the country, in Paris, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. People are watching the U.S. presidential inauguration. They've all come there, and there's a big crowd on the Mall. I'm going to speak to you today about his great historic subject, this great American institution. And I'm going to do it in the same way in which I organized the book. Rather, the book is not chronological. It's not divided up where that starts off with George Washington and then John Adams and going through the presidents in order. Instead, it's divided up by the various parts of the day. And within each part of the day, I sprinkle in vignettes. Some of them very serious, some of them, of course, very traditional, and a lot of them oddball events, because I'm always looking for those too. I'm also going to cover some things that we're not going to see in the upcoming inauguration in January, because this time we don't have a change of power. So we're not going to have that transition as we see sometimes. But nevertheless, in the morning, at inaugurations, when a president does leave office, in 1961, here's Dwight D. Eisenhower thanking the staff at the White House. At the same time, the incoming president, that year John F. Kennedy and his wife Jacqueline, they're leaving the Blair House, getting ready for the big day. Another thing that takes place on inauguration morning, and this will happen again, is a religious service. When I was in Washington with my wife a few years ago, just a half a block from where we were staying, there was this church called the First AME Church. It's a traditional African-American church, and that's where the inauguration church services took place for America's first black president, Bill Clinton. Now, I'll have a little map here for you. Things start off at the White House, and they move along Pennsylvania Avenue toward the Capitol, which is on the right there. And there's a traditional coffee at the White House that takes place, and it's a big deal on the days when there's a transition from one president to another. Again, 1961, and that was a year when a lot of these pictures were made available. You just don't normally see these pictures. Here's Eisenhower and Kennedy together, and at the same time, you have four women together, and these four women actually were the first ladies of our country between 1953 and 1974. On the left, that's Mamie Eisenhower, who was the outgoing First Lady. With her back to us, that's Lady Bird Johnson. There's Jacqueline Kennedy, who became the new First Lady in 1961, and Pat Nixon, who was the outgoing wife of the Vice President at that time. Another thing that takes place on Inauguration Day when there's a change of power is that by tradition, the outgoing president leaves a note for his successor. This is the note, this is the large envelope that was left in the Oval Office by George W. Bush for Barack Obama. He just put a Post-it on it with 44. And then inside was another envelope that said 244 from 43. And then the next morning, here's a picture of Barack Obama reading that actual note. The procession to the Capitol is always a big deal. They move along Pennsylvania Avenue there. And here's a picture from exactly 100 years ago, an open carriage, and that's William Howard Taft on the right and the new president, Woodrow Wilson, on the left. In 1933, we had a situation with Franklin D. Roosevelt and Herbert Hoover. The two of them didn't get along so well. There wasn't a lot of conversation during their ride to the Capitol. In many pictures that were taken that day, Roosevelt can be seen waving to the crowd or smiling to the crowd or turning toward Hoover and trying to have a conversation. But in every picture you'll ever see, Hoover's just sort of looking straight ahead, ignoring him. There have been other times also where the presidents, the new and the old, didn't get along so well, and those are mentioned in my book. That chapter is called Can't We All Get Along? Sometimes weather is a big issue. Here's in 1909, that's William Howard Taft driving together with Teddy Roosevelt. We can't see them, but they're in the carriage. And here's the route they take. That's Pennsylvania Avenue, heading toward the Capitol. Now, from 1829 all the way through 1977, which covers the great majority of American inaugurations, they took place on the east side of the Capitol. The east side, that's, if you've been to Washington, then you know that's where the side where the Library of Congress is and the United States Supreme Court. So here's what that looks like today on any given day. That's the east side of the Capitol. And that's what it looks like when they used to spruce it up for the inauguration. They'd have a platform there in front of it. Here's another view where you can see the platform there to the left. There's a press stand there in the middle, and the crowd gathers. But in 1981, everything switched. They decided to move it to the west side of the Capitol. And that's much larger, and that allows for far more people to actually see the ceremony. Here's what the west side looks like most days. And when they jazz it up for the inauguration, they put the bunting up, the flags, and that's what it looks like, what we've seen every inauguration since 1981. And there's another view where you can look all the way back. The Washington Monument can sort of be seen there at the background, and the Lincoln Memorial is even all the way, is even further than that. The inaugural ceremony itself. Now, we had an invocation here today. There's normally an invocation at a presidential inauguration also, and the quirk that I found took place in 1961 when Cardinal Cushing delivered the invocation at Kennedy's inauguration, and the platform actually started to catch fire. You can see the smoke right there, and you can see a marshal just to the right of Cardinal Cushing working to put it out, and you can also see the looks of concern on Eisenhower's and Kennedy's face. No question about that. Well, the marshal put it out. It was just a little short in the electrical system. Now, another thing that's taken place 4 times in our history has been a poet delivering a poem at a presidential inauguration. And the first time that ever took place was in 1961. There was a lot happening that year. Another thing that happened that year was Vice President Johnson botched the vice presidential inaugural oath. But here, dealing with the poem here, that's Robert Frost, famed poet, the first poet to ever speak at a presidential inauguration. And I think this is a good time for me to read an excerpt from the book. You all probably remember the famous poem called The Road Not Taken, written by Frost. So here's my chapter called The Poem Not Spoken. In 1961, 86-year-old Robert Frost became the first poet to ever be invited to speak at a presidential inauguration. In the days leading up to John F. Kennedy's inauguration, Frost wrote a special poem for the occasion called Dedication. There was a major snowstorm on the night before the ceremony. On the day of the inauguration, however, the sun was shining brightly and the sky was blue. Frost was about to begin to read his poem, but the very bright glare of the snow prevented him from being able to see his manuscript clearly. Here was one of the world's most famous poets, but he couldn't read his own words. New Vice President